So I didn't expect to go off script so quickly, but my video kind of stole my own thunder here. The entire intro is just shot. I wanted to open with that story of me kind of lying in bed at 14 where, I'm home alone, and it was not an uncommon occurrence. It was pretty much the regular day-to-day activities, right? And, when you hear that deep pounding on the door at 2 a.m., most would be startled. But I went through kind of a different gamut of emotions. My immediate response was somewhat relief. Anytime that you're dealing with somebody who is an addict to the point where, they can't really even help themselves any longer, it gets to this sense where you just wonder when the dam is going to break. And you understand that it has to go one way or the other. And nobody wishes for the extremes. As I kind of mentioned in the video, my nightly prayers were the same things every single time. It was, please let me make it as a professional baseball player, and please let my mother figure her way out of this awful path that she's fallen down. But the emotions didn't just stop there, because I still had to answer the door. I still had to deal with what was ever on the other side. I had just come to accept that at some point in time, I was going to get that call. I opened the door. It was my landlady, as mentioned in the video, and she just basically said that my granddad was on his way. Something happened to my mom. I had to take care of it. And then I went through a litany of other emotions that I think most people who are a byproduct of addiction are kind of dealing with on the regular. Whether they're suppressed or they're at the surface, I think you're constantly fighting this struggle between this fear that the person that you care about is going to destroy themselves completely, and now you're going to have to mourn them. The sadness of the reality that it's completely out of your control, and that, it's their cross to bear, not yours. Somewhat of acceptance, which was kind of like what I fell into at that point, where it was like, okay, I know something bad has happened now, and I'm just going to have to problem solve this moving forward. Deal with it, move on, and understand that she's been long gone long before this. And then a certain subtle sense of relief where you recognize that the person you care about is suffering deeply, and that there's very little you can do to help despite your best efforts, and that there's this certain inner demon that they're fighting on the daily. And you kind of take a little bit of solitude in the fact that they won't have to deal with this any longer. So when my granddad finally arrived and debriefed me on the situation at hand, mind you, I'm 14 years old. By all accounts, he probably should have just taken me to his house, put me to bed, told me to go to school in the morning, and fill me in later. But this had been a struggle we've been going through for the better part of a decade. And, he was well aware of my maturity level. You're forced to grow up fast. I was doing very adult things by the time that I was 7. I was often left home alone with my sister, fending for ourselves, making our meals, learning how to cook, clean, wash clothes. And you take that stuff for granted whenever you are kind of brought up in a traditional household. But the fact of the matter is, if we wanted a clean space in the house, we had to do it. I can recall times where we didn't own vacuum cleaners. We didn't have anything. We didn't have phones. We didn't have cable. We were so dirt poor. And I recall a time where I was in my bedroom on my hands and knees with a ruler, scraping up crumbs, just to get some level of control back in my environment. So, that level of maturity kind of forces you to grow up very, very fast and handle adult situations in a way that maybe you're not mature enough emotionally yet to deal with, but you really don't have a choice. So I look back on that very fondly. I'm happy that he had the confidence in me to kind of say look, this is what we're dealing with, come with me. And when he filled me in on what it was, that my mother was soliciting sex in exchange for drugs to an undercover police officer, I was just enraged. And not in a way that was very becoming of me. As an adult, I think I would have a different response, but as a 14-year-old, all that matters is your bubble. And that's all you're creating throughout the entire process of dealing with this other person's problem, right? I did nothing wrong from the day I was born until 14 when it comes to my environment, addiction, all these other things. But kids are cruel. So my day in and day out was literally just trying to create an environment that fit the norm and trying to hide from basically anybody and everybody who knew me what my home life was like. So I couldn't have people over. I couldn't expose who my mother was to other people. I couldn't let them know that I was this poor. It's an unfortunate side effect of just growing up. We kind of tend to shun the outcast. And my entire goal was to fit in. So when I found out that she was in jail for something so silly and so ridiculous, I didn't lean on compassion. I didn't lean on empathy. I let it rage because she was bursting my bubble. This was going to be in the newspaper. People were going to find out. I lived in a town with one stoplight, and I graduated with 48 other kids. It's impossible to keep this stuff a secret. For better or for worse, I can remember being taken into the jailhouse and pleading with the officer not to put it in the papers. And, he's an adult listening to a 14-year-old kid beg him where he's powerless because he understands the processes that they go through. They have to submit this stuff to the media. They have to do their job. And I can remember him saying well, we'll use her recently married name instead of her divorced last name. And I felt relief all over again. But the thing that I really felt was that this was it. From that day forward, she was completely and utterly dead to me. In the blog that was referenced in Dead Money, I kind of wrote about this. And I said that from that day until college, I turned my back on my mother. Her life spiraled, and I mourned. I suppressed any sadness or sympathy I could muster, and I turned a cold shoulder to her apologies and requests to reconnect. I spent so much of my childhood hiding what she had become that I rationalized away the guilt, and she was completely and utterly dead to me. I think that it's easy to demonize people who fall victim to addiction or any other vices or bad paths. At the core, we're all human. And being reflective, it's easy for me to understand that a lot better now. It's easy for me to look back and realize that addiction has a face. So I kind of wanted to not leave this bitter taste in everyone's mouth and kind of backtrack a little bit further and paint a picture of who my mother actually was prior to the day that I decided she was no longer going to be in my life. She was born in the late 50s. So her childhood was largely through the late 60s and 70s. She was a byproduct of the drug culture. It's just how the world was back then. She ran away at 18. Her and my grandmother had a very tumultuous relationship, which is very difficult for me to process because my grandparents were my saving grace. They treated me like, I can't even put into words how much of saviors they were to myself and my sister as far as keeping us in line and making sure that we became something. By age 20, she was raped. And I know this because she had no problems telling me about her past, her present, and how sad she was with who she had become. By the age of 8, I was fully understanding of her past and the struggles that she had gone through. A lot of this is a byproduct of what I witnessed in my environment growing up. By 22, she was married to an Army sergeant, my father, and by 25, she had had 2 children. Now, the problem with this is that my dad was incredibly abusive. And I don't know this from speculation. I've witnessed it. I've seen everything from him throw her through walls, to choke her to passing out, even to a point where I can remember very vividly, I was probably about 4 years old, and my dad came home in a storming rage. I don't know what he was upset about. It seemed to have something to do with dinner, but my mother was feeding me at the dining room table. And as he came in and went through his screaming fits as we had often seen, it escalated very quickly. As she continues to try to feed me, he goes and gets a shotgun. And while I'm on her lap, he has it in her mouth. So to say that she was suffering through trauma and neglect and abuse is a very large understatement. Now, fortunately, he never followed through with any of these threats, but he did send her into a bit of a mental tizzy. It wasn't long after this that she had filed for divorce, and his countermeasure was to admit her into a psychiatric care. So her first stint in the psychiatric ward was around age 29, I guess. So I would have been about 5. She went in. Obviously, she's a victim of abuse, so she's going to have symptoms of somebody who's not all together. They immediately diagnosed her as being schizophrenic. They put her on antidepressants. They began to heavily medicate her. Somehow, by the time she got out, she was able to push through the divorce, found the strength to move on, and get out of that situation. So by age 30, she was living on her own with 2 children. She had never worked a steady job. She had no college education. She was completely unemployable. And we were very quickly stricken to poverty. Throughout all this process, she coped. It began whenever I was very young. Her and my father used to smoke weed pretty openly. We understood what it was. I knew what the smell of it was by the time I was 5. Leading up to her divorce and the psychiatric care, she had drifted into anti-anxiety medicines like Xanax and was often heavily medicated. By the time she had gotten the divorce and we lived on her own, she had graduated to muscle relaxers, pain pills, and eventually when we completely became poverty-stricken, she was dabbling in crack cocaine. This led to her first episode of psychosis. I can remember very vividly, after she had gotten remarried to also a codependent new husband who was a functioning alcoholic, never missed a day of work, also never failed to buy a case of beer. They had an unfortunate miscarriage. And I can remember she was of sound mind when it happened. She told me about it. And, I was young. I didn't really even understand what that meant. But one day I came home from school and she was just on the porch sobbing. And I didn't understand why. As I probed her, I found out that she'd been going door to door through our entire neighborhood, asking if somebody had found her miscarried baby. She was positive that she actually brought it to term and somebody kidnapped it. So this led to her trying to find solutions through mental health, or I guess like psychiatric care. And they were never treating the root cause. They were never treating the trauma. They were never treating the drugs. Instead, they were leaning into it. They were giving her more medication. They were sending her on her way. She's there under her own volition at this point. So she would often check herself in and check herself out. And throughout all of this, I'm young. I'm loyal to my mother. My sister and I wouldn't leave her side. We would spend weeks at a time with my grandparents, but it was something where it's just difficult to separate children from their parents at that young of an age. So we clung to hope. My childhood prayers were dominated by the common request of asking God to get my mother help. Moreover, to ensure she got home every night safely. By the time I was 13, I'd been there for schizophrenic episodes. I'd spent a summer visiting her in a mental ward. I'd seen her choked, beaten, thrown through walls. I was also there when she attempted to cope. I tried to talk to her when her speech was so slurred beyond comprehension from abusing pain pills that she couldn't get a word out. I was in the car when she traded an old VCR for crack. I signed my sister's excuse blanks when she was too far gone to drag herself out of bed. But through it all, I prayed and begged she'd see the light to better herself for our sake. I was selfish. I thought everything had to be for our sake. I didn't care that we lived in a roach-filled apartment or that by her early 30s she had taken on the appearance of somebody who lost all will to live. I still saw the good in my mother. I wanted the best for her, and though I begrudged her on a daily basis for her decisions, I knew deep down there was a genuinely good person there. I know because no matter how strung out she had become, she always wanted for our happiness. There was such little control in her life, but she understood that school and friends meant the world to me. So despite moving multiple times in our childhood, we never left my hometown. Barely able to care for herself, she still pulled it together to ensure that our clothes were always clean. And on the rare occasion that there was actually fresh food to cook, we were sure to be served a home-cooked meal. Most importantly, she had enough presence of mind to build a strong relationship between myself and my grandparents. At the time, I felt like all my prayers were falling on deaf ears. But reflecting back, I realized my grandparents were the godsend that I had requested. It's a weird thing to grow up in this sort of environment and deal with the anxiety that comes along with it all throughout childhood. But I can't fathom that I'd be standing here today, or that I would be even remotely 10% as accomplished as I am if it weren't for being exposed to this at a young age. She built me, and she did it by exemplifying herself as what not to do. She was very open and transparent. She trusted me to a fault. And it's these examples that she gave that prevented me from ever straying outside the lines. I saw life very black and white as a kid. I was very critical of those caught in the struggle. I was very critical of people who did wrongdoing. Drugs were bad. Stealing was bad. Anything immoral was bad. My moral compass was incredibly high. And a lot of it was a byproduct of recognizing what I hated about my mother. She was very vulnerable and transparent. As I mentioned, by the time I was 8, I fully understood the path that had led her to where she was. But I didn't grasp it. You can hear these things and understand that they're traumatic, but you can't figure out why an adult can't handle them. And lastly, she demonized her lifestyle. She was very quick to point out all of the pitfalls of the choices that she had made. She would point to her friends who would OD. She would demonstrate, how awful our life actually was because we were so poor and so full of, I guess, lack of hope, for a better word, because of the choices that she's made. And she even would use scare tactics, which, when you're 6, work. She told me a story of how my cousin, when he was 16, was walking home from school, and older kids picked him up, threw him in the backseat of the car, and made him smoke weed. Now, looking back on this now, it's almost laughable. Like, what a silly thing. That obviously didn't happen, and even if it did, it's not going to be that traumatic of an experience comparatively. But she had the fear of God in me when it came to those things. Like, that was equivalent to a kidnapping as far as my eyes worked. And, to this day, I've literally never used any sort of substance in my life. I've never smoked, drank, done drugs, anything along those lines. And people always ask me why. And they assume that it's because of my mother. And I'm sure subconsciously it is. She instilled this moral compass inside of me. But I've always been this way. I've never had this curiosity. And I like to chalk it up to, like, well, I had bigger goals and aspirations than that. So, I wasn't going to allow myself to falter. And that may be true on the conscious level. But subconsciously, it was because of these methodologies that she instilled in me at a young age that made me recognize there was no coloring outside the lines when it came to morality. The thing is, I still remembered who she was deep down. The version of her who loved me and my sister unconditionally. The woman who spent the better part of my life encouraging me to conquer the world. Eventually, the anger and the disdain subsided. I began to understand her mental illness and realized real-world problems, particularly addiction, don't get solved through turning a blind eye or casting someone aside in hopes that they can muster the strength to fix themselves. Most can't. Still, for the past 2 decades, the most I could feel was sympathy for my mother. I remained incredibly guarded, feeling that if I became empathetic, if I extended too much of a helping hand, she would prey upon my generosity. I would go so far as to pick up the tab when she'd bottom out, and I'd answer her calls in moments of clarity when I realized not every call was a plea for cash, but more so a subtle cry for help. The mix of excitement and hurt in her voice each time I answered the phone made me often question if I was right to distance myself. Unfortunately, I was still selfish. I was concerned with protecting myself from her lifestyle, and I never stepped in to offer her a way out. She was too far gone in my eyes, or perhaps I was just too far removed. So as you heard in the Dead Money video, her death was very underwhelming when it occurred. Months prior to her passing, she had overdosed, and I was actually home. My grandmother had just been diagnosed with terminal cancer, so I was there to start the process of caring for her. And I got a call from my sister. Hey, mom's in the ICU. She overdosed last night. She needs somebody to go pick her up. She's being let out soon. So, it's just been my role to kind of shoulder the load with this kind of stuff. I still had a lot of resentment towards her, but largely I just moved past it and decided that I would go pick her up. And when I did, I just didn't see the hope anymore. She was just too far gone. She was lucid in nature. She seemingly was just spouting a lot of nonsense that wasn't really founded in reality. But through it all, she was just like extremely excited and proud that I was there to pick her up. Almost like as if she got admitted in the hopes that I would be the one to grab her and shake it out of her. Obviously, I still was very cold. I turned my back on her again, and I sent her on her way. A couple months later, I was playing a World Series event, and I just get a simple text from my sister. Hey, mom died in her sleep last night. And to be honest, I didn't feel anything. I didn't know what to feel. I went back to that 14-year-old laying in bed hearing the knock at the door, and I understood all of the emotions all over again. And I felt the acceptance that this was out of my hands and it was her cross to bear. And I felt the relief that she had spent 50 years battling this disease. And I felt remorse that I wasn't able to do more, because at the end of the day, no matter how much we try, it's impossible to separate ourselves from the concept of control. And I wanted to control the outcome. I wanted so badly to solve her problems. Ironically, that's effectively what I do now. Shortly thereafter, I developed a company called Solve for Why, and currently it's just poker training, but I hope to graduate into much more. The concept behind it is taking grand holistic problems and solving them from a why-centric point of view. So we try to find the root cause. And in poker, which is a very complex game, that can be difficult sometimes. My hopes are that that will translate. Things like addiction, world hunger, homelessness. All these problems don't get solved by Band-Aids. You can't just throw money at it. You can't just try to hold someone's hand through it. There needs to be a deeper meaning behind it and a way that we can ultimately come together to find a solution. In researching this, I came across a couple fascinating studies, and they kind of indicate that everything we know about addiction is flawed, or at least everything we think we know. Bruce Alexander, a professor of psychology in Vancouver, in the early 70s began running addiction studies on rats. In the first study that he ran, he took one single rat, put it in a cage, and gave him two options of water bottles. One was laced with cocaine, the other one had nothing. Within a matter of days, the rat always overdosed. No matter how many times he ran the experiment, the rat would always choose the cocaine water. And from that, he began to recognize, or at least he thought, that meant that there were chemical hooks in the drug that were forcing this rat to choose poorly over and over and over again until death. But after about a decade of running studies similar to this, he thought, well, let me change the variables, because in this situation, it's just one rat, 2 water bottles in a cage. And he developed this thing called Rat Park. Now, in Rat Park, we see much more of a common social construct. So the rat was surrounded by a litany of friends, potential mates, as much food as it could eat, obstacles to play with, and then 2 water bottles, one laced with cocaine and one with just water. And over a number of trials, they found no overdoses. The rat very rarely chose the cocaine. It chose society instead. So that kind of poses the question of, what if addiction is environmental? Humans by nature are social creatures. We want to be integrated. We're tribal, right? We want to have a community. We want to have a pecking order. We want to be able to puff our chest and be proud of ourselves and those around us. When we're isolated or exiled, we look to bond elsewhere, and often that elsewhere will just be substance. It's escapism from an unfulfilling reality. In the current system, most addicts are going to go through a societal judgment similar to what I was imploring on my mother at 14. They're going to be ostracized. They're going to be embarrassed. They're going to be punished, and they're going to be stigmatized. Currently speaking, addicts are suffering all of these things on a daily basis. They are going to jail for usage. They're going to jail for survival mechanisms of selling or stealing or whatever they're doing to try to get by, because off the back end of addiction is poverty. If we then recognize that the opposite of addiction is connection, shouldn't we be putting our resources towards reintegrating people? In the early 2000s, Portugal had 1% of their population addicted to opioids. They decided at that point all of their methodologies were just failing. So instead of getting more scrutiny on the laws, cracking down, putting more people in jail, they instead decided to make it fully legal. And all the money that they were pouring into prevention, they were reallocating to recovery methods. Consider it a human park. They were creating programs that would reintegrate people to society, that would put people back into communities, that would give them purpose in life. 15 years later, the IV drug usage went down by 50%. It's a significant improvement. So then what's the big picture solution? It's way above my pay grade. I don't necessarily know. But speaking from my own perspective, if I could go back and do it all over again, if I was mature enough at 14 to know what I know now, I would start with acceptance. As somebody who is indirectly impacted, the first thing you need to do is strip away the layer of anger, because that's the knee-jerk reaction. So I would accept that it's not my cross to bear. I would accept that it's not an attack against me and that my mother isn't doing this purposefully to hurt me. And I would accept that everybody's flawed. And her flaw just seems to be a lot more obvious to me than most others. I would try to provide value rather than some sort of Band-Aid. So I would offer her love, comfort, understanding. Basically encourage her to help herself. Because at the end of the day, no matter what we try to do as outsiders, we have no control over the situation of the person who's suffering on a day-to-day basis. And lastly, I would try to empathize. And I can't personally empathize because I've never experienced drug use, but I understand suffering. And that's ultimately what this distills down to. There's something going on in the brain of a user, of an addict, that is forcing them to choose the water bottle with cocaine instead of Rat Park. And the best thing that we can do as a support system is to try to recognize that suffering without a solution is one of the most ultimate hells that we can experience on earth. So just finding a way to make a connection with people who are going through it and give them a pathway back into being a normal person in society is, in my opinion, the only way that we see a solution here. Friday evening in 2015, I couldn't sleep. I was physically and mentally exhausted from the long hours of play during the World Series of Poker, yet I couldn't quite quiet my thoughts. And I don't struggle to sleep. I'm the kind of person who, when my head hits the pillow, I'm out like a light. For some reason, my mother was on my mind in a way that I hadn't felt since I was a kid. I questioned why it was so easy for me to treat her like a burden, and why I hadn't made more of an effort to extend a helping hand in a meaningful way, not just financially. Having come from nothing, I have no tolerance for an apathetic crowd who turn a blind eye to poor souls who have been beaten to their knees by life. Yet, there I laid. It was an internal struggle that finally allowed me to acknowledge that I had finally forgiven her. That through it all, I was a better man for having been raised by a woman who did everything wrong but truly ached to make it all right. I closed my eyes with a promise to myself that next time she called, I would answer. Unfortunately, the next afternoon, I found out my mother passed away that night in her sleep. Thank you.